Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Crisis and Critique podcast, Philosophy and its Other Scene. My name is Frank Ruda, and I greet you as always together with my friend and colleague Agon Hamza. Before I will introduce our very special guest today, I want to mention briefly that the new issue of the Crisis and Critique journal will be coming out next month, and it will be devoted to the thought and philosophical system of the French philosopher Alain Badiou. If you like the work that we're doing with the journal and the podcast, or if you only like the podcast or only the journal, please become a subscriber. And if you really like the work that we're doing, consider becoming a patron. But now to the really important things. We have with us today the wonderful Joshua Oppenheimer. He's not only a professor at the Westminster School of Art, he is a very well-known Oscar-nominated film director, professor of film at the University of Westminster. He studied film at Harvard and at Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design in London. His much praised and discussed debut feature film, The Act of Killing, that's 2012, addressed the Indonesian mass killings of 65-66 and won many prizes, including, I'm just giving you a selection, the European Film Award for Best Documentary, the Audience Award at the Berlinale International Film Festival, the Robert Award by the Film Academy of Denmark, the Guardian Film Award for Best Film, and the Grand Jury Award at the Venice Film Festival, a festival where it also won other movie awards, but I'm not going to mention all of them. His second feature, The Look of Silence, that's 2014, has received over 70 awards and presents the troubling history of the Indonesian mass killings now from the perspective of the victims. I think it's no overstatement that Joshua's work has reshaped the very means and understanding of narrating, showing, and depicting that which in history seems, at least, ultimately impossible to narrate, show, or depict, which is certainly one of the reasons why Cinema Eye Honors named Joshua Oppenheimer a decade-defining filmmaker in 2016 already, and both of the mentioned films as decade-defining films. His work has explored, and I would say reinvented, the very possibilities of documentary filmmaking and cinema, and in its relation to history and its darkest moments, the moments where history seems to have gone awry. That his is therefore also an immensely political project is abundantly clear for anyone who has come into touch with his or contact with his work, which is why it came as a surprise, I think, to at least some, that his most recent movie, The End, released in 2024, is a musical that portrays the life of a wealthy family 2 decades after the end of the world, to which they themselves contributed and which by some commentators was received as a newly creative form of a never before seen Brechtian form of cinema. We're very grateful that you're taking the time to talk to us, Joshua. It is an immense pleasure, and herewith I give the floor to Agon, who's going to kickstart our conversation.
Thank you so much.
Joshua, thank you so much. We are really happy and excited to have this conversation with you today. So let me begin with our first question. As Frank mentioned, you are a director, a professor of film at the University of Westminster in London, and you're also politically engaged. Your movies address pressing political and ideological problems: mass murder, genocide, climate catastrophe, impunity, guilt, remembrance, to name just a few. You once said that you, and I'm quoting you, you went to college initially thinking I would study theoretical physics because I was interested in the nature of existence. And in some ways, I see my exploration in film as a continuation of that. We would like to know more about how a film is a continuation of theoretical physics with other means, if we can evoke a rather infamous dictum.
Yeah, I think I was, first of all, it's a delight to be here with you both. And I think I was essentially interested in the nature of the profound, unaccountable mystery of being. And I was drawn to physics as a first way of looking at that. And what always struck me is the mystery of consciousness. It feels as fundamental, as irreducible as the mystery of physical being, that there should be space and time, that there should actually be an interiority to matter, at least some forms of matter, where it perceives, where it actually feels and has, I guess, what philosophers call qualia, a sense of value and subjective impressions. And physics had presented all sorts of fascinating accounts of the origin of the material universe, but it never really offered any way of thinking about consciousness, although quantum mechanics at least offered this crack that somehow the act of measuring, the act of observing might affect the observed in ways that were utterly mysterious. And then I thought maybe, and it felt deeply intuitive to me, that maybe consciousness is somehow, or at least the potential for consciousness is embedded in the fabric of the universe. So I think Thomas Nagel has recently tried to grapple with in this book, Mind and Cosmos, which I quite appreciate. But I was my physics professors were definitely not encouraging me to sort of take the interpretation of quantum mechanics that consciousness is a requirement of the measure the collapse of waves into particles when you measure something in a quantum system. And they still were all on board the project that you can somehow account for consciousness through physical and chemical properties of the brain and so forth. But I find that deeply unconvincing that somehow consciousness can emerge simply and solely from and be reduced to the physical arrangement of matter. And I started to, for reasons that I think Nagel describes really beautifully in that book, and I won't go into here because it would take us quite far from I don't know what we have to talk about today. But I started to realize that the world, the way we see the world, is deeply influenced by how we imagine. And I thought that maybe we can use the camera as a way of documenting the performative qualities by which we tell stories through our very practices of being, the way we are in the world, and we naturalize and reinscribe and reinforce those stories until they feel completely natural through the way we are, the way we behave. And the idea that because cameras document human behavior in a way that no other technology we have, motion picture cameras document human behavior in a way that no other technology we have does, I thought there must be a way of using this technology to create a kind of prism that takes that breaks a performance, breaks an imagination, breaks a sense of self into its constituent narratives and fantasies and beliefs and ideas and habits, in the same way that white light can be broken down into its constituent colors. And so, yeah, I shifted via a brief stint in theater and philosophy. I shifted over to film. And I never really gave up on, I never lost sight of that lesson from quantum mechanics that whenever you observe something, you're changing it. So I came from I studied film in a department where there was quite a lot of emphasis. I was very encouraged to go in my own wild way by my very wild and wonderful and dear mentor, Dusan Makavejev, who's Yugoslavia's, I think, greatest filmmaker. But but it was a department that really also had a strong tradition of direct observational cinema. The idea that, you could make a film as if the camera was a fly on the wall. And that's always a simulation. You always are getting your participants to pretend that the camera's a fly on the wall, when in fact it's almost always an elephant in the room. Not that participants don't forget themselves at times. And that just never struck me as the most interesting thing to do with a camera. I thought if you're working with people to kind of understand what subjectivity is, what consciousness is, what dreams are, what imagination is, how culture and politics feeds into that and conditions that, how we're all implicated in that, habits of belief that are just habits but feel inevitable. I thought there must be ways of collaborating with your participants, whether it's a fiction film or a documentary, where you're really designing situations that push everyone beyond their comfort zone in such a way that you're with razor sharp focus, but also open to the unexpected. In fact, always open to the unexpected, trying to shed light on some important questions or mysteries that you're setting out to explore by making the film.
Thank you for that. And I think, I mean, it was very interesting to hear you say that your sense is consciousness cannot be reduced to just as physicalists would do, right? I mean, just to matter moving in some way. And I think that connects quite well to a comment that Werner Herzog once made about your work. He also co-produced one of your films, and he said that your work blurs the line between fiction and documentary. And that was meant as a praise, obviously, for, let's say, if there is such a thing as an at least aspirational, pure fact-based documentary, it lacks something. It always lacks something, and what it lacks is the dimension of truth somehow, right? Something that is more than just a fact. And in this sense, one could say maybe documentary movies are not just an educational tool, right? They don't tell us about facts, but they're artistic products and objects. They're art that generates something. Hegel would have said, art is different. Artistic objects are always different from other objects because they display a truth about the world. Right? A sentence I always liked is that he says somewhere, an artwork is always more real than reality because it tells us something about reality. And we wanted to raise the question: what is it that orients you in your approach to presenting truth, in your way of transmitting truth to an audience, in your way of presenting more than just what objectively happened? Or put differently, how do you see that your films subjectivize, make the audience into subjects that respond, react, and see things in a transformed way after encountering your films?
Well, that's quite a question. I think there's a kind of, I was about to answer in a more straightforward way, but then my mind is going somewhere less straightforward that's exploratory. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but I think I really try, and it's through the songs in the end, it's through the kind of fever dream, that the way that the act of killing becomes a fever dream and sort of leaves any recognizable documentary form behind, and the way the look of silence is this kind of like half whispered, half conscious poem. And this, I've just finished a little film, or just finished editing a little film that does something similar. It's almost like a half conscious prayer. I think I try to immerse people in a place that's haptic, that's physical, that's embodied, that it's doing things to something Duchamp used to say to me. I don't think I understood him when I was a student, but I remember him saying, you know, your film should work on all five senses. It's image and sound, but how does it taste? How does it smell? How does it feel? And I think opening up realms of experience through immersive, oniric, dreamlike kind of unfolding that feels emotionally and spiritually and cosmologically inevitable, while at the same time build it working within the narrative structure, however loose, of the piece as a whole, is one way that I'm addressing people outside the realm of storyteller and listener, which is the classic metaphor for filmmaking. We're storytellers, and we do tell stories, but we do so much more. And the other, maybe more straightforward answer I had was that I think I am always thinking about how I'm always thinking about how we tell stories defensively to protect ourselves from uncomfortable realities. So before you can get to the truth, you need to be honest about how you lie to yourself to keep it very black and white, how we deceive ourselves, how we, as I often say about the end, but it applies to all my work, how we tell stories to obscure the world from ourselves and to obscure ourselves from ourselves. a big theme of my work has been the desire to appear virtuous and certainly to not face our regrets and our unpleasant aspects of our life, whether it's ways we've hurt people or ways we've or the simple fact that we're mortal. And the idea that we can make up and cling to narratives, to stories that we know we've made up, but that we also manage to believe, to ease these regrets, or to not see essential truths that make us human. That that capacity to lie to ourselves is probably what makes us human. It's probably, while it may get us through some very tight spots where we know you need to kind of just believe that you're going to be able to, that you can survive this, if you to find the energy not to succumb to despair and to just get through it. But probably as a species, it's one of our fatal flaws. It's what we see happening with climate change, where we just tell ourselves, we know the reality, but we tell ourselves a whole range of stories about the limits of our agency, about some about our just faith that something will rescue us, about our hope that probably it won't be as bad as we think, which is related to our faith that something will. But we tell ourselves a whole range of actually contradictory stories to allow ourselves to do nothing rather than perhaps face our fear and face our shame that we're in a situation where we're quite powerless and that we've left a situation to our uh, children and grandchildren that's dire indeed. I think I think that a lot of my work is trying to invite people to see how we lie to ourselves, to understand the ways that we constitute ourselves through defensive self-protective narratives, and to see and to kind of excavate those and see how those emerge out of popular culture, out of politics, out of um, power dynamics that structure our society and therefore our very being.
Thank you so much for this. Let's move to your latest film, which is called The End, released in 2024, starring Tilda Swinton, George McKay, Michael Shannon, and among others. This is your first narrative feature film. You co-authored the screenplay with Rasmus Heisterberg. But before moving to the film itself, Frank and I have been pondering about the role of mirrors in your movies. They're a motive both in the end as well as in the act of killing. In the end, they're a huge part of your film. For instance, in Swinton's solo performance, she's engaged with or speaks to herself through the mirror. When we look in the mirror, we see ourselves plus something we cannot see without the reflective surface. We see the world with us in it. It is as if we see the world without our absence. That is, without that blind spot which marks our indelible immersion in it. The figure of the double is very popular in science fiction and was later picked up by
The figure of the what?
the figure of the double. The double. It was very popular in science fiction, and then later was picked up by Freud and Lacan. And in early modernity, it was also associated with the experience of the anguish or the uncanny. What is the mirror a signifier of in your films? What is the relation between movies and mirrors?
Well, at the simplest level, to the point that it's almost banal, I think I try to make films that function as mirrors to the audience, to implicate them. I seem to make, on a surface level, I'm making films that appear to be about at least the act of killing in the end, less so the look of silence, where we identify with Adi Rukun. And which, interestingly, there's no mirror, because I think the mirror in that film is the material that Adi Rukun is confronting them with, and the propaganda footage that he from the American and Western propaganda footage that we are watching as viewers, which is a mirror of our society, and Adi's and the confrontations between Adi and the perpetrators he meets. I don't believe there's any. I can't recall any shots of mirrors in the film beyond that. I think in I seem to make films about people who we would like to think are extreme cases and quite different from us. Certainly that's true of Anwar Congo, where I kind of would appear to have gone looking for a monster, and certainly the audience is hoping to see a monster, and we end up finding a human being. Echoing Primo Levi's statement, there may be monsters among us, and I'm paraphrasing, but they're too few to worry about. The real monsters or the real thing we have to worry about are people like ourselves. And I would argue, building on what I said previously, that what makes us monstrous in our behavior are the lies we tell ourselves when we refuse to look honestly at our behavior. I believe almost all of us have a moral core that would revolt and force us to change were we unable to legitimate the way our patterns of destruction. And in the end, we get the feeling, oh, we're looking at a wealthy, destructive family about that we expect whom we expect to satirize, to look at from an ironic distance. And we end up finding not just wealthy people, but people of all classes in the bunker. Someone absolutely lumpen who manages to enter the bunker and is incorporated into the world. A servant, a middle class black doctor, a working class servant, some kind of truly middle class friend of the mother. And the characters are nameless because they are all of us. It's not just the last human family. It's not just a billionaire's family and its household. It's every human family. It's my family for sure. And I remember my father saw the film with George Mackay, and he said to George afterwards, "My God, you really studied my son to make this film, didn't you?" And George kind of looked at me before responding some way that in his body language and his facial expression meant yes, of course. But because he could feel how personal the script is and the material is. So I seem to be presenting these extreme cases, but finding in them allegories for self-deception that's universal and presenting these films as challenging mirrors, sort of inviting the audience to take a journey from a sense of superiority to a sense of being implicated, and that's uncomfortable for some people, and it's why certainly the act of killing and the end have been polarizing films. I think at the same time, when I talk about self-deception, the film's about all the ways that we misrecognize ourselves in the mirror. The song that Tilda sings in front of the mirror is just an excellent example of that. First, she thinks she's looking at a stranger, and she runs in her song, and she runs through some etiquette protocol that she must have learned when she was aspiringly trying to move from the middle classes to her wealthy husband's upper class. And she greets this stranger politely until suddenly she's caught off guard on the word of the tacited word shame, which is defining her character. And suddenly that stranger is no longer a stranger at all. It's the mother who she killed, her mother, whom in a sense she's increasingly realizing she killed by not inviting along to the bunker. Now she's singing to a mother. And then as the bathroom dissolves away and she's no longer in her bathroom and she's out in the empty salt mine, she's singing to the dead. But her encounter with herself in the mirror is all about trying to run away from what she sees. And that's really the principle that gets the characters singing in the end and gets them reenacting in the act of killing. Truth enters their bubble. I guess in the act of killing, it's by me as an antagonist, kind of prodding Anwar to remember. In the end, it comes from the arrival of a young woman from outside with whom the mother seriously and fatefully identifies, and to whom the son is very drawn. Truth enters their bubble, and the lies, the fantasies, the excuses that have held their world together start to crumble. And Anwar starts trying to dramatize his past in ways that are somehow palatable or romantic or glamorous so that he can live with it. And the family in the end starts singing. Their lies and their excuses crumble, and they rather desperately, like victims of a shipwreck who've been, cast into the sea, they reach desperately for the flotsam and jetsam of the wreck to cobble together a raft, but they do so by reaching for melody and for lyric to kind of convince themselves through song that all is still well in their world when patently their illusions are crumbling and are wrecked on the shoals of truth. So they really, the encounter with the mirror is always about is always double. It's a metaphor for what the work's doing, trying to get us to see who we really are. And also, it's that generative encounter that leads us to lie to ourselves. That generative encounter for all of the stories we tell ourselves, the lies we tell ourselves, the rituals that define our daily life. In the end, the mother places a great value on the clothes she's wearing and her hair and the art on the walls and costumes and makeup. I remember and hair. I remember talking to the costume designer and the hair and makeup designer saying, your roles are crucial here because you are the only thing. You give the characters the only thing between them and their naked reflection in the mirror. And in a certain way, it just occurs to me answering this question. I know that was a long answer, but it occurs to me that when I say the films are polarizing and audiences, some viewers resist seeing themselves in the mirror of the film, it's interesting how people who've rejected the films on one viewing and for some reason or other have lingered on the films either because they can't get them out of their minds or they're with a friend or loved one who has a different take on the film or they have to see it later. They come to see it again later or they're drawn to rewatch it for reasons they don't understand. They start to see that resistance was precisely generative of some self-deception. And I've had so many people over the years come to me about the end and the act of killing, saying, I hated the film at first. And I told myself all sorts of stories about how these people are monsters and they deserve a kind of a comeuppance and a vicious comeuppance that you seem to refuse to give them until I realized that whole defensive reaction was a kind of avoidance of seeing myself in the mirror of the film, which is how I use the mirrors for the characters in the film too, in the films.
That's really clarifying and helpful. I mean, I think what you described first as defensive storytelling or self-deception just now, I think it relates very interestingly to the question of what is a post-apocalyptic musical doing actually in that very form.
Let me just before we come to that, let me just say one thing that just occurred to me as you were speaking. I think defensive storytelling, self-protective storytelling, the tragedy of it and why these immersive spaces that I try to place people in are so important too is that the stories are what make us who we are. I mean, our consciousness is this kind of appearance of images and thoughts of which we're not in control. And if we're telling ourselves or clinging to ideas about ourselves that are false, it sort of erases ourselves. And I remember Errol Morris, the director, saying that, you can peel back the layers of a person in your work. And the question is there anything is it like Russian dolls or an onion? There's nothing. It's like Peer Gynt's onion. There's nothing inside. And I think that's correct, except there is the longing, which I think is the source of morality, actually, and the source of compassion. There is the longing to peel back the layer, both for the audience and even for the person who has the stone in their shoe of moral unease. Okay, so please continue.
No. This very helpful, I think, and connects to what we wanted to ask. I mean, the apocalyptic tropes are so present nowadays, and we were wondering. I mean, how did you approach with the end this trope, which as a filmmaker, because on one side, what I mean, I think that some psychoanalysts have basically said, well, there are three passions with human beings: love, hate, and ignorance. We really desire not to know somehow, and we invent all kinds of forms to get around knowing. And one is even speaking of that, which we don't want to know anything of. And so we wanted to ask you, how did you approach the trope of the apocalypse? Is it, I mean, because especially in films, right? It has been such a resource. It has been so overly present in Hollywood and so forth. How did you approach and even imagine dealing with this in a filmic way, in your unique manner?
I think it has to do with continuity with the present. I think, first of all, I'm just finishing a little film called The Revolution Against Death. And I think there's the genocide in Indonesia is a kind of apocalypse. Death is a kind of personal apocalypse. And of course, the end of the world is a collective apocalypse. And in all three films, we're looking at, I mean, of course, in Indonesia, they're after the apocalypse and it's about the present. It appears to be, so it's post-apocalyptic in that sense. It's after the end. The end is also after the end. And the revolution against death is about people thinking about their mortality and struggling to deny their mortality and the longing that underpins that. And that's ahead of they're still alive, but they're preparing for a kind of apocalypse. I think all three of these projects are about our present. The people will say the act of killing is about a genocide in the past, as I just said. Really, no, it's about the present tense of impunity, the present tense impunity in which these stories and lies about the past are flourishing, and that is sustained by those lies, the corruption that's built on those lies, the silencing of victims' families that's built on those lies. The end, here's where I'm going to get a little, here's where I'm going to venture that the end appears to be about the future, but I always thought it's really about our present. The dysfunctions of that family just mirror the present. And my friend, the philosopher Srečko Horvat, told me, introduced me to a book that he wrote, which I think it really unlocked, I think, my instincts. This was after the end was done, but unlocked what I was doing there, which goes to the meaning of the word apocalypse. Apocalypse comes from the Greek, an uncovering or a revealing, which is why the book of Revelation is revelation. It's the apocalypse. And it occurs to Srečko, and I think he's absolutely right, that we're the first human beings on this earth who are living after it, who are living after the revelation, to whom it has already been revealed how we will end if we just carry on exactly as we are. This is a little different from the 50s and after the advent of the hydrogen bomb, where you would still have to launch a nuclear war to end. Now we're simply told, just keep going. Just carry on like Wile E. Coyote, running straight. Just carry on forward blissfully, and soon you'll be in free fall and you won't even know it. And when you pass those tipping points, we may already be in free fall and not know it, though I sincerely hope we are not, and have to sort of believe, and this may be a sustaining self-deception, but have to believe we're not. But I think the idea that we are actually living after the apocalypse, after the revelation of how we will end, and the question then, what responsibility does that place on us? What must we do to change course if there's still time? Because I believe, and we wouldn't have made the film if we didn't believe there is still time. And what must we do in view of the fact that each of us face a more intimate end with through our mortality? What must we do to have meaningful lives in the time that remains? It's a question that Ishiguro, I suppose, explores in The Remains of the Day. That question is really what the film is about. And in that sense, now thinking of Ishiguro, who just popped to mind because it's connected to another project I'm working on, there's this issue of love. And I think in a certain way, the end is really a film about love and about how when we lie to ourselves and lie to our loved ones, people we ought to love, about things that have transpired between us, about our relationship to the world and to each other, about who we are, we turn those relationships into these kind of that ought to be full and sustaining and mirror back to us our fullest human potential. We turn them somehow into these minefields of silence, these places, no minefields of no-go areas. Oh, we mustn't talk about that. We can't talk about that until very soon you're just sitting with people to whom you're kind of attached somehow, but unable to really explore the substance of your life anymore. And that comes at the cost of life itself, in my view, or at least what life could be. And I think the end is really a cautionary tale about what happens when we do that collectively as a species, and what happens when we do that, now, in the post-apocalypse of our own lives, because it's been revealed to each and every one of us that we will die, and in the post-apocalypse of this collective moment where we know we have to resist, we have to fight the overwhelming power of the fossil fuel industry that has tipped the scales in such a way that we are doomed if we do not fight. And by fight, I mean embrace every form of creative, nonviolent, civil disobedience, except for sitting alone on social media and posting things, which is not disobedience at all and undermines the very idea of collectivity because it pretends to be engagement while in fact participating in a wholly competitive economy of who gets the most traffic, who gets the most likes, uh, whose whose ego gets the greatest boost, who enjoys the greatest dopamine rush by positive feedback in a field of vanity.
Thank you so much. Well, you said so many important things, and I think what you're about to ask really connects very well with all of it. But I think I share also Frank's belief here that we couldn't agree more about your attitude towards social media, and that. So many people declare the truth of a climate change and the possibility of a climate catastrophe or apocalypse, but then they do nothing. If we exclude conferences or, as you said, social media posting or all these things. So we are thinking of the psychoanalytical concept of disavowal, first coined by Octave Magnoni and just recently developed really nicely by Alenka Zupancic, which can be best articulated in the following way. We know very well that the climate change is real, but nevertheless, we go on as if this knowledge didn't really matter. Would you make a distinction between an apocalypse and a catastrophe? And in this sense, would your main candidate be the climate apocalypse, if you can put it this way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's so useful. First of all, this idea of disavowal is what I always talk about as cognitive dissonance, but I think where you know but don't believe. It's something I talked a great deal about with Anwar in the context of Anwar Congo. I think we know that if we carry on as we are, we don't we know that we can't do that, but we somehow don't fully believe. I think that's somehow the psychic structure of disavowal, and it reminds me of I grew up near Los Alamos, and my last name is Oppenheimer, but I'm not related, at least not very closely. And I remember hearing that Los Alamos had the greatest concentration of PhDs in the United States, and also the greatest, and they were designing, basically, it was not entirely, but largely a city where scientists were gathered to design weapons of mass destruction. And it also had the greatest concentration of churches. And understanding Wittgenstein's later philosophy of language on holiday really helped me understand that paradox that, okay, you can go to, if there's no philosophical conundrum in going to work all week with a thoroughly secular understanding of matter and designing bombs and going to church on Sunday and somehow consoling yourself. And those two things have to bear no common rational foundation, logical foundation, those two systems of thought. And I think that capacity, that's something I noticed with Anwar Congo trying to live with the catastrophe of what he had done, to use that word, and to live in a post-apocalyptic situation of having he knew that he would have to live for the rest of his life with that catastrophe. He would jump from one, and this is true in the end too, and it's true in, but just sticking with Anwar, he would jump from one genre to the next, from one form of lying to another form of lying. One would say, I'm a saint because I delivered my victims to heaven and gave them a chance at redemption, which they wouldn't otherwise have because they were atheists. It's an argument that makes zero sense if you pause to think about it, but does when you have a choral rendition of Born Free playing over it, because then the music just smooths out the sharp contradictions and so on. And then when that felt false to him, he would long to do something else, and he would switch to a kind of film noir gangster scene where, yes, he was cruel and violent, but he had to be because that was the glamorous thing to do. And then when that led him to feel awful about himself again, he could just switch back to the other or something like it. So if you have two, I sort of learned making that work that if you have two sustaining lies, at least two, then you can flip-flop forever back and forth between them. And they don't have to work together at all. And that structure of being able to, they don't have to be consistent at all. So the idea that that um, that the climate, you know that if we carry on as we are, we're going to reach a catastrophic tipping point very soon with the climate, and then and you maybe even participate in a protest around that. But then when it comes to voting, you're somehow hailed or it's funny. I think it only comes to mind because you sent me your questions in advance, or some of your questions, but you mentioned Althusser. You're somehow interpolated in a way where you are thinking about something else. You're engaging with a different context, a different language game, and you're suddenly voting for a party that is, you know, uh, maybe even appealing to the same to some anti-xenophobic liberalism, but is therefore against regulation and is feeding into the climate catastrophe. So you can be even your politics can be contradictory. It's not just your work life and your church religious life. So I think this ability to be contradictory in this world, in this way, what you call disavowal, what I've always thought of just as cognitive dissonance, is essentially what makes us human, and it's what all my work is about somehow. That plus the great mystery of what we are beyond those uh, narratives that don't fit together. Um, I absolutely think catastrophe is at once is a wonderful term for the consequences of the self-deception, the consequences where every process is headed when it's not looking at reality in an accurate way, when it's not there, when there's no reality check, and or when its whole way of looking at reality is rooted in a lie. It's what's wrong with, it's why economics scares me so much, liberal economics, this idea that it reduces people, it models people in a way that I can't believe is what we really are. It's what we're turned into by the model and by the economy that we then have no choice but to engage with in order to survive. But the sort of rational actor theory foundation of economic theory is, I wonder if economics can help us avoid the worst, at least uh, capitalist economic theory, because I think it's built on a lie. So yeah, I think catastrophe is the outcome of activity, resource depletion, energy expenditure, interaction that's built on self-deception for motives that we wouldn't be able to admit to ourselves without shame, honestly, or something like shame, were it not for without and hence run away from. And I think apocalypse, I really want to stick to that idea that it's the revelation of those consequences. So it precedes catastrophe.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. And I think that the point you just highlighted, I mean, namely the cognitive dissonance, what you frame in terms of cognitive dissonance, and or the two regimes of lies between which we can switch to avoid confronting something. It, is it, could one say it is linked to a certain limits of imagination? Because the recently deceased cultural critic Frederick Jameson once claimed famously that people find it easier to imagine the end of the world, like a comet hitting Earth or whatsoever, than to imagine the end of capitalism. And capitalism there stands for the way in which we organize our world these days, like, right, the dominant mode. Is The End also a movie about, let's say, the end of capitalism, or how we can approach imagining differently?
I think I mean, there was an earlier question you sort of smuggled in there about the limits of the imagination. I think the self-deception is what conditions our imagination. So yes, absolutely, it also defines its limits. And I think following Jameson and his base fundamental connection to sort of the idea that economic structure, at least somehow, provides a foundation upon which, superstructure and ideology then emerge. I think, I think it is really hard to imagine the end of capitalism because our whole profusion, and it's a beautiful profusion in a way, but a potentially very catastrophic one of imaginative of fantasies is predicated on the erasure of the invisibilization of its debt to capitalism, or its structural connection to capitalism. So I think it's really hard from the, oh, Michael Shannon has this tattoo, and I think it's on his arm that he got recently that's based on, it's a quotation from Einstein, and it says something, and I'm going to get it wrong, but I think it's similar to this in premise. You can't solve a problem. Oh, I've got it wrong. Oh, I'll have to ask Michael, but um, you can't solve a problem with the tools that created the problem or something like this. So somehow it's, sorry, forgive me that, but it was essentially the idea that, how are you going to imagine the end of capitalism when all the kind of narratives of your imagination, um, all the narratives that populate your imagination and the forms and of story that condition your imagination emerged to render capitalism itself invisible, but in particular its role in conditioning those narratives. And I guess I have a way that I try to do that, which is just, whether it's by playing narratives against each other and kind of rubbing them against each other and creating sparks and disruption in the jump from one dramatization to another in the act of killing, or one verse or one musical genre to another in the end. But I think by allowing the multiple narratives in their fragmentary form, the multiple narratives of self-deception in their fragmentary form, to somehow rub against each other and deconstruct one another, destroy one another. I think that's the one way that we can imagine our way out of the essential blind spot you're talking about. And then you asked, so that I think is maybe the more important question that you sort of jumped past. But then then your main question was, is the film about the end of capitalism? The film is about the continuation of capitalism. It's about our capitalism as it is now. And the family is not dead at the very end of it, but in the very final shot, we see them fading away, the mother and the girl, after one beautifully melodious lie where they sing, "Once the world was full of strangers, we kept our distance, so many dangers, we trusted no one." And it's one of the most beautiful melodies in the film. And it's a lie, because when the girl arrives, at least she's nothing if not trusting. So it's not true that she trusted no one. And so after one last lie, we see them gazing into the darkness, reminded that they're the last family on Earth. And very, very, very slowly they fade away into the nothingness or into the indifferent, frightened, primordial soup of life that may remain when they're gone. Um, that would be the end of capitalism. So the last shot is the end of capitalism, and one would, but no, the film, even if there's no money in that bunker, even if there's no longer salary, even if there's no longer the classical exploitation of labor in an economic sense, it's still capitalism. It's not post-capitalism. It's the capitalism we live with now, and it's the very last gasp of it after the catastrophe.
Thank you so much for this. In 1965, there was a military coup in Indonesia, led by General Suharto. Shortly afterwards, it is said that over 2.5 million people were opponents of the new military dictatorship were killed by the new dictatorship. This dictatorship was known as the New Order. The killings were committed not only by the army but also by the gangster group, paramilitaries, and so on. The act of killing is a film precisely about these killings. What is unique about your film, which, as Frank mentioned in the introduction, has been nominated for Oscars, won BAFTA, and all other prizes, is that perpetrators do not really have the slightest remorse about their acts. On the contrary, they boast about it until the last scene. Looking back at it 13 years after, Anwar Congo, the main or the first subject of the film, has passed away. Suharto is more or less rehabilitated. There are discussions or debates on awarding him the status of the national hero by the Indonesian government. Indonesia is still more or less governed, if not by the same people, then by the same groups or ideology. But Congo and Anwar Congo and his friends are self-described as cinema gangsters who use cinema as a base for their real criminal acts or activity. They fabricated their image as well as their methods of murder after the Hollywood movies and Star, who were projected on the screens of the cinemas that they ran. The relation between cinema and the mass murder is what your film explores. In other words, your film is a documentary about the real effects of living a fiction. Can you tell us more a bit about this territory, namely the relation between cinema and mass murder? For Congo, to refer to him again, acting was always part of killing. We're particularly thinking about the end scenes in which the performance and the reality are convoluted. It becomes difficult to distinguish between the two.
Yeah, I think I want to elaborate. I mean, there's the film is about the relationship between cinema and mass murder and is an intervention in that relationship in so many different ways. First of all, while it's true that it's no longer merely contemplated that that Suharto be given the status of a national hero, he got it this past week, as did the commander of one of the key killing forces of the army, Sarwoedi Wibowo, who they talk about in the act of killing on the talk show that the state television puts up about him. So in a certain sense, one could say the regime is intact. On the other hand, the films did transform the way the country talks about its past, where there was no debate, where the debate was silenced. There's now a rich counterculture, and also that's crept into the schools and into the education curricula, where this is actually talked about as a crime against humanity, as genocide. The American decision to declassify, as a result of the films and the debate it caused, to declassify, tens of thousands of documents around the killings, was most important, not so much for how it incriminated America, although it did that, um, but because those documents provided proof of what had happened in a country that up to now had minimized it. So suddenly there's this archive from an ally saying this many tens of thousands of people were killed. It became undeniable. Well, except the caveat being that, as I said earlier, everything is deniable. We see that with Trump. We see it with the physicists who go to church on Sunday, denying all the science they're working with all week and the purpose of their work. But it the reality persists in the discussion, allowing an ongoing struggle, an ongoing conflict, an ongoing fight over the truth to emerge where before there had been a kind of collective fear-enforced silence. The film, in terms of the actual relationship between, I talked about how Anwar earlier was flit from one set image of himself to another. It's a, it's a, there was a particularly explicit connection between the narratives that Anwar would inhabit and the fantasies he would hold of himself to justify his actions and to live with his actions, and cinema genres, because he and his fellow death squad members in the city of Medan were recruited by the army from the ranks of these gangsters who hung out in movie theaters. And that meant that he literally could walk out of it, as he says in the film, a James Dean movie, walk across the road from the cinema, acting like James Dean or acting like Elvis Presley, is I think the example he gives in the film, and get a little stoned or a little drunk, lose himself, forget himself, if you will, in that play, and thus distanced and detached from the present because he's in a fantasy realm, kill. And as he puts it, kill happily, because Elvis was happy in the performance. So in that sense, acting, even acting for himself, was always part of the act of killing, let alone the more macabre fact that he was probably acting to scare his victims when he was torturing them. But I think that was a secondary point. The real thing he was doing was acting in order not to see the moment and not to see himself, to put himself in the kind of blind spot that every actor wants to be in, lest they're self-conscious and can't perform. Actors don't want to be aware of the fact that they're acting when they're in the middle of a performance. It's why result-oriented direction is so disturbing for an actor, especially if you're one of those directors who some do this, calls out a direction in the middle of a take. So acting was always part of the act of killing, and it explores that. I think also, I had questions about the film, how could you be so grotesque as to make a musical or a Western about a genocide? And I would say, well, hold on right there, because Westerns were always about genocide. I mean, that's the whole premise of the Western. You kill all the Native Americans, or you don't show the killing of the Native Americans, but open a frontier and then watch the law come and colonize it. That's kind of the basic structure of most Westerns. So it was always a genre that glorifies genocide. I think, with mass entertainment using motion picture, cinema and the stories we tell ourselves that allow us to that sustain the lies we tell ourselves. And I don't want to even say the stories we tell ourselves, the images we hold of ourselves, the way we know ourselves, how we dream of ourselves, who we wish we were. Those images that allow us to evade any relationship with truth and to evade the consequences of our actions, and which, as I said a moment ago, lead to catastrophe, and in this case, mass killing. They're intricately related. And in societies that are built on mass killing, like the United States of America or like Western Europe, and I follow Walter Benjamin's lead here when he said, every artifact of civilization is at the same time an artifact of barbarism. Cinema equally and motion picture equally sustains the ways that we, quite a bit removed from the killing in comparison to Anwar, but nevertheless just as implicated. It sustains the way we imagine ourselves and want to see ourselves in the context of societies that, in our heart of hearts, if we really looked at the material arrangements that we rely on to eat and to have this conversation, we would know entail mass violence and histories of mass violence that we're constantly not facing through the self-understandings given to us by or sustained at this point by cinema. If we didn't have cinema, we'd get them from somewhere else. I think it's something deeper than cinema. And then I think my films, by trying to collide those impressions, to try, and this goes all the way back to the very first question of what I was trying to do when I turned to cinema as a means of understanding consciousness and critiquing the political and intervening in the political ramifications of let us just go to the to the old term false consciousness. What I try to do is to make visible those narratives. I gave that example of a prism before, and then like putting two diodes, by like electricity that arcs between two charged objects, to have them spark and reveal each other by bringing them up close.
Jumping ahead a little bit, but absolutely connecting to what you just said, at least the Look of Silence and The Act of Killing are films about the idea or the concept and the effects of impunity. A concept that, I mean, you just mentioned Trump, but it's just really prevalent today, because we see, as we haven't seen, I think, in some time, but very powerful individuals doing all kinds of things without any kind of responsibility check at work anymore. And your work shows that impunity has a very tricky but a clear relationship to guilt. That is something that comes out in The Act of Killing, clearly in The Look of Silence. How would you say these two are intertwined for you? What can maybe specifically film do to make us more attuned to their peculiar relationship, or maybe in a slightly different formula, can it puncture the images that we have of ourselves so that some of the, let's say, guilt comes to the fore or seeps through through self-deceptive images that we have of ourselves?
Yeah, I think they sustain each other, impunity and guilt. I think that out of fear of facing our guilt, and that can be a fear of our own remorse, but I think a very powerful force is shame. Fear of, fear of admitting our guilt, fear of how we appear in the eyes of others when we're guilty, let alone fear of the consequences if there were the possibility of punishment, actual justice. Fear of that leads us to do everything we can to justify our actions, and if we're in the midst of doing something wrong, to prevail. I mean, people participate in genocide because they expect to win. I think it's the exception, not the rule, that perpetrators of mass violence lose the war and are ultimately, to some degree or another, held to account. And even then, when that's happened after World War II, for example, it's very partial. And the perpetrators to mass violence on the other side are, of course, never held to account. So I think that I draw this distinction, and it's probably like drugstore psychology, because I'm really not an expert. But I draw this distinction between guilt and shame, where guilt is a personal kind of compunction. It's a feeling of pain, almost. It's an unbearable feeling. And I think you can escape guilt to some extent by telling yourself that, by lying to yourself, and seeking the approval of others. And I'll maybe give an example of that in a minute. But shame is somehow a concern with how you appear in the eyes of others. And I think shame in particular prompts us to do everything we can to cover our tracks, to win, and to maintain our impunity and self-deception and imposing those lies on everyone around you, insisting that, making propaganda that says, not just telling yourself you're a hero, but insisting that the entire society you've subjugated, in the case of the act of killing or Indonesia, views you as a hero. With Suharto now, the dictator who came to power through engineering the genocide, and his right-hand men have just been elevated as heroes all these decades later because everyone who's had power in that society has abused it. That's how they've had the power and maintained the power and enriched themselves. So they all have things to hide. So you have generation after generation of powerful people who can't afford to face their guilt because they'd also have to somehow lose face and lose status. And then I'd also just say there's a story that's not in the act of killing, but I've told a fair number of times that I think is really important. It has to do with what happened to Anwar when he first killed someone, first killed one of the so-called communists. The person wasn't a communist. It was someone he knew who was labeled a communist by the army. He was told to kill him. He did. And he went home and he didn't like this man, but he'd known him since they were kids. And he went home that night and he felt awful. I mean, he was nauseous. He was sick. I think the killing was bloodier than he later would learn to kill people. But he came back to that office the next day, just a mess. And everyone reassured him and said, no, it was great what you did yesterday. It was heroic. You were saving the nation. And it felt good to him. It made him feel a little bit better. And he was kind of reassured and they patted him on the back. And when they sensed he was feeling well enough, they took him into the next room and there were two more prisoners. Like, now we'd like you to kill these two. And he was faced with a terrible dilemma. Do I go ahead and save the nation again and kill these two? Or do I admit it was wrong the first time? What's really instructive about this story is that what compelled him to kill the next two, at least in part, there was also, I'm sure, pressure and whatever, but part of what was compelling him to kill the next two people was his guilt. So while we tend to think of guilt as the thing that is associated with our goodness and our morality, and it is, and it's humane. It's an essential part of what we celebrate as human virtue. If you pass a certain threshold, and that threshold probably lies in different places for different people, our guilt can become such a frightening thing that we're compelled to look away from it, or we'll do anything not to face it. And then we're locked into patterns of destruction because you have to just maintain the lie. You have to repeat. And I think that dynamic across, the tens of thousands of people that maintain a power structure generates not just impunity, is a big part of what generates the force insisting upon impunity, imposing impunity on a society and imposing the excuses on a society.
Thank you so much. So together with Joran ten Brink, you edited a book called Killer Images, Documentary Film Memory and the Performance of Violence, published with Columbia University Press in 2013, if we're not mistaken. In your co-authored chapter, Show of Force, a cinema sense of power and violence in Sumatra's plantation belt, you write about two characters, Amir Hassan Nasution and Young Siach. The former was the commander of Commandi Aksi death squad in a certain district, while Young was a member of a death squad. It is interesting, albeit not really peculiar, that this killing is not really an Indonesian specialty, that people like Amir would end up being painters and writers. Coming myself from former Yugoslavia, this story is too familiar. The leader of Bosnian Serbs, Radovan Karadzic, a psychiatrist by profession, was not only a ruthless political and military leader, but he was also a poet. and we think poetry should be taken very seriously here, as in the sense the ethnic cleansing of Bosnian Muslim was a continuation of poetry with other means, to evoke again the infamous dictum. Poetry is the means for ethnic cleansing. And in this text, you refer to Althusser's, as you mentioned earlier, famous essay on ideology, and you read the ritual as a performing ideology. Ideology is not so much conceived as a set of theoretical propositions that determine you, but rather exists in practice, in rituals like bowing deference, saluting, etc. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this, especially on Althusser's, on how Althusser's theory may allow us to make sense of the rituals of mass killings?
Oh, you're muted.
Can you turn the mic on? Sorry.
First, I want to say that Inong Shah is, if anyone's curious about Amir Hassan Nasution and Inong Shah and the graphic novel and kind of artistic mind of Amir Hassan Nasution, you can see them in the Look of Silence. They're the two death squad leaders who go down to the river together, and it's the first perpetrator that Inong Shah is the first perpetrator whom Adi Rukun confronts, and Amir Hassan is dead by the time we shoot the film, but his family is the last, his wife, his widow, and his two sons are the last people that I'd say Adi Rukun and I confront. Actually, I'm quite active in both of those two confrontations. And the first one with Inong ends with Inong all angry at me too, telling me to turn off the camera. The Althusser quote is remote from my mind. And this is many years ago now. So forgive me. I think the chapter from that book, although it was published in 2013, I wrote it as part of my PhD back in, and then reworked it a little with Yoram, but that would have been back in 2005. So we're talking 21 years ago. It's a long time ago since I have read Althusser. But I think this thing you said, I want to just linger on this thing because I think it's maybe we can get there from there. This thing you said about the Bosnian genocide, that it's poetry by other means. I think that reminds me, well, first of all, I think that it is that dovetails with what I've been saying about these romantic self-conceptions that allow us to continue behavior, which is always gestures and habitualized gestures and rituals that lead to catastrophe without us knowing it, or by finding it bearable because it's so sugar-coated in a cloud of, or in layers of romance and sweetness and sentimentality, that we don't really see what we're doing. And it also reminds me of the songs in the end. The end is also very strongly a film about impunity, where it's not just that they sing lies and the silence lie is where the truth lies, which is a kind of inversion of the musical genre, how truth and lies work in the musical. It's an inversion of how we typically, the cliche about how truth lies in musical, that people sing their deepest truth. I'd say they sing their lies, but even more so, I think very often when their lies have fallen apart, when their excuses have fallen apart, the characters tend to switch mode to a poetic and romanticizing mode. And that's also what leads to song, and something similar with Anwar. So it's a certain kind of sentimentality, which is always inherently escapist, which I'm pretty allergic, even when it's serving as propaganda for solidarity. I think, I'll just say it, I think great works of cinema that use sentimentality to inspire solidarity are not, according to my definition, art. And I think the same is true if it's inspiring participation in catastrophe, like Leni Riefenstahl's cinema, or much commercial cinema. I think that going back to what I said about mirrors, I think I try to use film, and I think this is what defines all true art as a kind of mirror, whether it's where we recognize either physically in an embodied haptic way or through an image or through a sound or just through a feeling, a part of ourselves which is fundamentally true, which we instantly recognize as true because we haven't looked at it in a long time. It's like we didn't know it was there, we were in denial of it. I think that's what art is. It's that moment of recognition. And then there's aesthetics and there's craft and there's all these things that can be marshaled to that end. And then they can also be marshaled to entertainment or propaganda or other forms of storytelling and creative expression that I would just say, just out of as a kind of normative matter, as a kind of moral stand, is not art. And um, I think of something Hannah Arendt wrote about Eichmann, where she talks about him getting carried away by what she called, and maybe even Eichmann called, I think it was her formulation, words with wings. He would kind of be speaking, and then suddenly he would find a turn of phrase that just felt delicious in his mouth, and his cadence would shift, and he would articulate it with relish, and it allowed him to detach from whatever he was talking about and shift modes, leave reality and enter a romantic mode that ultimately had catastrophic consequences because it would allow him to proceed without looking at where he was going or where he was. And that the catastrophic quality of sentimentality and lyric, when lyric is deployed wholly for a sentimental purpose. Of course, you can use sentimentality to drop people in a moment of awareness where, and this is what I try to do more than anything in my work, where they suddenly come face to face with the awful consequences, the tragic consequences, the urgent consequences of sentimental escapism itself, the catastrophic consequences for the purpose of this conversation. That's using sentimentality. And that's, for example, what happens in the final song in the end or in the waterfall scene in The Act of Killing. That's using sentimentality to provoke a moment of recognition where we feel the costs of sentimentality in our own lives individually and collectively. And those two things can never be separated. Um, I'm not sure I answered your question, Agon, but you tell me if you want to follow up.
No, I think that was very good. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you so much.
Um, and to almost conclude and end, we wanted to ask, what are the new projects? You mentioned two, I think. What are the new projects on the horizon? What are we gonna see in the nearby future? Is it still
Well,
dealing
in
with
the
the
nearby
yeah,
future, you'll see The Revolution Against Death. It's a short film. It'll come out sometime next year. Um, it's a poem. It's a little like it's a reflect. It grew out of it grew out of and is a response to the end. It is a documentary, actually, or a nonfiction poem about longing and mortality and fear. Um, as far as what comes after that, making fiction, I love the transparency with my collaborators that, when you make a documentary, there's always this gap, and we've been talking about it, between how people want to be seen, which is by you, or at least by your camera, so therefore by you, and how they really see themselves. And even if you love the character, even if it's someone with whom you feel complete solidarity, as I did with Adi Rukun in The Look of Silence, you can never talk about that gap with them. So the shooting process of a documentary, and it's precisely that gap that makes documentary footage, when it's interesting, really interesting, because it's the primary source of subtext in nonfiction filmmaking. It's the primary source of the difference between what people are saying and what is really happening. And you can't talk about it. And it's what makes you gasp and laugh and giggle behind the camera and just fall in love with what's happening. And it's terrible when you're done shooting, you can't talk to the person about it. You can't, you know, have a beer at the end of the day and say, oh, that was amazing what happened there. And it's lonely year after year of that. Maybe you can talk about it with your collaborators, but now I'm going to say something controversial, but quite a lot, not, this isn't true of my collaborators, but a lot of documentary people have a very serious idea about what their purpose is. And I know I can come across as serious, but I think it's mainly a lot of giggling on set when when I'm on a shoot, when I'm doing documentary, that I have to suppress from the participants so they don't hear it. And so it doesn't fuck up the sound, which is a problem. Like I remember where the Herman in The Act of Killing was getting dressed in some of those incredible dresses. I just remember really having to walk away from the camera, make sure if it was on a tripod or someone else was holding it, just so I could laugh, because not at him, but just because I was so delighted by the openness and the generosity. So I really, but there's something lonely about not being able to share with your closest collaborator, who's always the person you're filming, what you love. And I loved and of course that subtext in a fiction film is the actor's craft, right? That's exactly their work. And to be able to talk about it is so delightful. And for me, who grew up in a family where I was a bit of a pleaser, I think. I mentioned my dad uh, saying that George's character in the end, who's a consummate pleaser, my dad saying that he must have studied me. I'm a bit of a pleaser because I grew up in a family where there was divorce and where my parents had totally conflicting narratives. And sort of, I felt that my job was to feed each of them what they wanted to hear. And it just being able to finally be really honest about what we were doing and what I thought was important and what they listen to what they thought was important and come together and try and synthesize that into something that neither of us could ever have imagined on our own just from reading the script, even if I wrote the script. That was that felt like a belated coming of age. So I'll demur from providing details of other projects, but even though there's that short documentary poem coming out, now I'll always root my fiction work in a documentary reality. We haven't talked about this, but the end grew out of an actual oligarch who was buying a bunker. Um, and my interactions with him and his family, I'm diving in headlong into narrative because it's where I was all the way back before I came across the Indonesian genocide. So it's not really a change. It's going back to my roots, but yeah.
Well, we're very much looking forward to seeing this and to see what is next that you're not yet revealing. But we always end our conversation with a series of either/or questions. You can obviously reject to choose. You can also elaborate on your choice, but you absolutely don't have to. So can we begin with?
Yeah, let me try. I want to try and do this with the exclusive either or. I think it's just like a cop out if I say both. So with the pinch of salt that sometimes you may present me with a choice where I would think both are of great value. It's no fun if I'm like both. I don't want to answer that. So I'm going to try and choose one for every single thing you propose and just think, my composer on the end, Josh Schmidt, brilliant composer, taught me this. So it would say that, when you're working creatively, if you have an idea, you have no idea if it's true, it's worth just blurting it because that's the only way you can trust that you mean what you're saying. So I'm going to blurt answers when I really don't know. And just know this is my first blurt. If I think about it, it can be completely revised.
Okay, so the first question, documentary or film or feature film?
Feature film.
Film or series?
Film.
Theory or practice?
Practice.
Making or watching a movie?
Making.
Writing or directing?
Writing.
Teaching or directing?
Teaching or directing?
Yeah.
It's funny because the Danish word for it, and I'm a lot of my work is rooted in Denmark. The Danish word for a director is an instructor, an instructor. Teaching or directing? Directing.
Music or musical?
Music.
And the very last one, fatalism or hope?
Hope. That one, those were really hard, but hope is absolutely that like hope. And I would distinguish hope from optimism. Optimism is very often the opposite of hope, and it's why the end is a musical. The musical is the genre of optimism, a kind of false hope. It's kind of wolf of despair in the sheep's clothing of hope, where no matter what is going down, you have to say the sun will come out tomorrow. Or as they say in the end, if our future is bright. So hope, hope, hope. It may be too late for the family in the end, but it's not too late for us. I hope that very sincerely. Everyone who made the film hopes that very sincerely. We wouldn't have spent all that money and all that time making it. Eight years in my case, if I didn't hope that there was still time to heed the warning of its cautionary tale.
Thank you so much,
Joshua, thank you so
This was
much.
fantastic.
This was amazing. We truly enjoyed it.